Sitting on my front porch, listening to that rain come down, really puts me in a mind to take a leaf out of Grandpa's book and break out a couple of beers and sit around with my feet up. But there is no rest for the wicked, so it appears I'm on the hook for another 5 stories. So, while this glorious rain beats down around the eaves of my old house out in the middle of nowhere, let's get started, shall we? We all have had that special someone, I would hope at least. There really is nothing like the admiration of that special someone. But sometimes they can be unapproachable, unwilling, maybe even ethereal. So let's hope that you have better luck when you find your dream girl. She walks through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong, black, and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over 5 years, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my final mystery. But the poem's subject is, herself, a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who steals a little more of my soul every night, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through the silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage hormones. For years, I'd been told that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that it lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. That's what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the ideas of servitude but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had often told me that I had talent, and told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the writer trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic table outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of those threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before, and dreamed vividly as I did sometimes. In the dreams, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day, I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey at school in your underwear sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater sometimes, everything having a slightly wavy feeling to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive, but at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world. Several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me 2 things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me. Her very secrecy, humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds, as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her. not turning to speak or looking for her, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple white shirt with no particular design. She seemed to be about my age, but could have been older, I suppose. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in my mind. Like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote those 4 lines. I wouldn't revisit her for another 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen what lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named her after the second verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I wrote pieces for every school contest, submitted poems for every poetry club event, and I gained a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that followed in those circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers noticed my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside of my high school community. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days, crafting the perfect poem, the most significant work of my life. When I hit send on the submission email, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the efforts of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into the deep and untroubled sleep of the dead for 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of the high school and saw the ethereal backdrop of my dream again. I was comfortable here. It was comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets running through my head lately. But something was missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me. But she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember truly being alone in this place, and it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed. But I felt my steps taking me steadily into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream would take me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the place's unusual stillness. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. A few minutes or hours or days would pass, and then it would happen again. Thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from the boiler room. It was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians for storing extra chemicals or broken machinery that they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less academic cast went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handle, though, I was immediately thrown backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling through that door. It was her, the Dream Girl, and she turned to glare at me, teeth bared in a feral challenge. When she saw who I was, she stopped growling and scrambled down the hall towards my English class. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. I'm familiar with lucid dreaming, and probably led to me becoming a little too comfortable in this dream. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of those fears, and as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first few words of our strange relationship, "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later, we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors. It sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us, chewing up everything that got in its way. My guide took us down a hallway that led to another hallway that led to another hallway, taking corners at random before finally wrenching open the door to the custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She closed the door behind us, cracking it a little as she peeked out into the hallway. All I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall becoming tired in a dream before, and as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I had hit it. I wanted to ask things, wanted to know what was chasing us and why it was chasing us, but as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway as a creature like nothing I had ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow. It was darkness. And as its form slither crawled past us, I looked at its amorphous boundlessness. She closed the door quietly before it came even with us and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" She looked at me quizzically, and I feared that she was incapable of hearing me for a moment. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she had actually had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sounds my words made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell that it likes. And when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me, "I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick with disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me that she believed she was 16, but she couldn't be sure. She told me that she'd been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. "Between dreams?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Instead of telling me, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall started to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness. We were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on to infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into the landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream. She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know we're here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me, and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of a precipice, looking at the world from afar. I am a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy. They thought I was living in the clouds. In my mind, however, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream, and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped, but it was no use. 2 weeks later, I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt, the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, like old dust or sour memories or the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice I heard relief. "Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed." She took me back to the field of flowers. Then she answered my questions. I asked her probably about 1,000,000 questions as we sat together in the field. She had found a tree that sprang from the flowers, and we sat there as she told me her story. Till that moment, I believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years, but as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I guess. I now realize she was afraid that telling it to me would make it real. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and was a princess, with knights and wizards at her command, dragons and goblins that needed slaying. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them. You can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world, the after. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time. Years, she said. Then, one day, something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edge of her kingdom, and it had actually killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always come along to heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it just looked wrong. I hid inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand out against the wall of the castle as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared in the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she jumped through it without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep actually, but as for eating and drinking, she found that she didn't need those things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, But she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was one of the first people to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed her, believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her for my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell them who she was. They believed that she was someone at the school that I was spending my nights with. I had people who had read my works asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave them very little information. For her part, I could tell that she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get too close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I could scarcely describe them. But she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasions, though, and I remembered being filled with a warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our nights would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us and screamily suck his way around, groping, as we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him and said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that she would never really be safe as long as it existed. As time passed, I noticed her become more and more melancholy. The one night I asked what was troubling her, she took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 years. I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that I won't be left alone when the dawn comes. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life. She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave her forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well, and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shade. She detailed her plans, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going, with or without you. She walked out, and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I found myself fighting sleep for the next few days. By then, I was almost out of high school, about to start college, in fact, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since early in the year. I woke up to my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days, I drank coffee, took caffeine pills. My face stung from where I had slapped it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought that she might become something worse after she killed the shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle, and I was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one. The silence was oppressive. In the ethereal halls, I wonder. The only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom, every mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name as I threw caution to the wind, wanting nothing but the solace of her voice, of her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, to apologize for my cowardice. A cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. But I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going into that basement to settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem, and if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so he can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. I can't think of any better reason to have a front porch than sitting on it and listening to the rain. Can you? It's a little chilly out here, what with December creeping up in the rafters, but I like it. And all this flat land out here just suits my sensibilities. We've all had some strange things that we kept around, maybe totems or items or just things that make us feel good. Well, we may have to watch that they don't attract the unwelcome eyes of something that might think they were tasty. So, be sure you protect yourself from the Dream Eater.
Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel. This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the 4th ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations to the phone if you..." But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just..." "Don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I..." "Just..." She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some. I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them. And stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in. "Don't worry," it whispered, its voice high and waspish. "I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country." Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists. But Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming, and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on. She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch, Michelle whispered, hanging up as she stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again.
Plip, plop, plip, plop, plip, plop goes the rain on the tin roof. All this rain lately, I swear. It's a wonder I just don't float away. We've all stayed in some questionable hotels. I know I have. Boy, could I tell you some stories. But it's best to check for pests if you're staying in a new place. After all, it wouldn't be very comfortable when the bed bugs bite.
It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce, so I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres Trailer Court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant, too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seem to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's 30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 2 20s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back and had just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino, but when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bed bugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench, and when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful.
I like to take a nap after I sit around and listen to the rain, but some of the writing I get up to, I don't know. Sometimes I think the rain really soaks the darkness into my gray matter, really brings out the good horror. Wouldn't you say? We've all had some strange occurrences around faith, but what happens when the thing you thought you were worshiping is a little different, a little more of the eldritch variety? So, let's find out how deep your faith goes. Let's find out the depths of your faith. I'm sitting at my computer, soaking wet in the clothes I've been wearing all evening. I want to get this all down while I can still remember it perfectly. I say that like I'll ever be able to forget it. I was raised Baptist. I've lived in the Deep South for most of my life, and it was normal to be religious, even zealously so. I went to the usual activities: Bible vacation school, church camp, church 3 nights a week, sermons on Sundays, and until I went to college, I was pretty much a regular churchgoer. Once I left for college, kind of getting out of that environment, I kind of fell off, though. Suddenly, passing classes was a little more important than keeping up with my spiritual health. Suddenly, parties and dating were more important than my relationship with God. So I blinked one day and realized it had been almost 15 years since I'd been to church, and I thought I might like to experience it again. A quick Google search showed me a church in my area that wasn't too far out of town and seemed like it'd be a good fit for me. I saw from their community Facebook page that they were having an event on Saturday. Just a meet and greet for new members, bring a covered dish for the potluck, with a spiritual event to follow where new members could get baptized and join the church. I didn't have anything going on Saturday, so I thought that sounded pretty good. I made a macaroni casserole, one of the few things I actually knew how to make, and on Saturday, I sat at about 3 p.m. in my best church clothes. As I pulled up outside the church, I was worried that I might be a little underdressed in my button-up and work slacks. People were going in, men in suits, crisp white shirts, ladies in long dresses, and kids in the sort of Sunday school clothes I was used to seeing at different churches. Made me think there might be a dress code. I was new, though, and I figured that if I wasn't within that dress code, they'd let me know. So I took my dish and headed for the fellowship hall that was set off beside the church. I walked in the side door to a very familiar scene. The welcome was immediate and warm. A woman came to take my dish to the table as the pastor came to introduce himself as Pastor Marshall. I had expected a firm handshake and, to be left alone to mingle, but the pastor took me to each of the little groups there and introduced me to his congregation. I met his deacons, their families, the aldermen and their wives, the treasurer, the underpastors, and about 24 other families. I was escorted to the food table by some of the deacons and told which dishes were the best and which ones were best avoided. Miss Liz is a good woman, but there's quite a few eggshells in her dressing. And which had been made by eligible ladies of the church. Miss Conroy's daughter's about your age and makes a great pecan pie. I was spirited away to a table where I was bombarded with questions and anecdotes and given the usual church gossip. It was honestly a little like being home again. The church I'd belonged to in my childhood was very tight-knit, and
As the kids ran around and the adults talked and laughed quietly, I felt a sense of homecoming wash over me. As the food was eaten and the plates were thrown away, we all moved into the worship hall for service. I sat on the front row with the 4 or 5 other new faces, and as Pastor Marshall mounted the pulpit, I couldn't help but smile. I felt a warmth in me, and I was already thinking about how I would have to change my schedule so I could come on Sundays and Wednesdays. As he laid out a sermon on acceptance and forgiveness, I began to reflect on my life here. It's hard not to when you've found somewhere you intend to stay for a while. In my mind, I would find fulfillment in the church, just like I had as a kid. I'd meet a nice girl, raise a family, grow old within the community, where they would support me and my little ones. I know it sounds a little silly, but we all know the places that our mind goes during times like this. I see we have some new faces on the front bench tonight. Would any of you like to join our church and get baptized tonight? I stood up like a coal had been lit under me. I felt moved in a way that I never had to go to the altar, to renew my vows to God, and be washed clean in the baptismal font. The pastor smiled as he waved me up, and I had to stop myself from sprinting up the stairs. I was excited. I was in such a hurry to be part of this. I had no idea what I was in for. The pastor had me recite the affirmation, the renewal of my promise to God, and when he turned to indicate the space behind the pulpit, I realized they had an indoor baptismal pool. I'd never seen one of those before. We always did our baptisms in a nearby creek, but as he took my hand and led me towards it, I realized he meant to baptize me fully clothed. I fished the things out of my pocket that I didn't want to get wet, my phone, my keys, my wallet, etc., and set them on the stairs before stepping into the slightly warm water. I wouldn't normally have agreed to let my clothes get wet. I don't like being in wet clothes as a rule, but I was operating in a daze, and when he knelt to dip me, I felt my knees bending as I went down as well. I baptize you in the name of the Father, His Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good luck. I opened my mouth to ask why I would need luck, but as he dipped me back, my mouth was filled with water, and I was enveloped in the warm embrace of the pool. It didn't have the acrid smell of chlorine like I had thought it would. It was salty, actually, and that took me by surprise. I lay on my back beneath the water, waiting to be pulled back up, and when I opened my eyes, I realized that the hand was gone, and I was alone in the depths of the pool. The pool was suddenly deeper than I remembered it. The surface glimmered miles above me. The bottom was a shadowy depth beneath me, and I was floating in the depths like a diver. I started to panic, thinking I would drown, but the longer I sat beneath, the less I was worried. I was floating in the placid space, hovering in the placental moment, and I felt utterly at peace with the world and everything within it. I didn't notice that something was getting closer to me until it was almost too late. It began as a chill in the water, something that chased away the warmth of that pool. I opened an eye, looking to the far side, and saw a shadow rising from the distance. It was small at first, a black cloud that grew as it floated closer, but it grew wider as it came towards me. It was, I don't know. It was like something you see from the depths when you're still in the part of the water where the light can reach you. It was something I was afraid would take hold of me and drag me into the murk where I would be lost. Whatever it was, it filled me with a dread that I had never known before. As it continued to draw closer, I thought it might be a whale. I had thought at first that it might be a bank of darkness, but as it grew closer, I could see that the blackness was just how it looked. It seemed to exist inside its own fog of murk, and what I could see wasn't terribly pleasant. Its skin was gray, pebbly like a stony shore, and it appeared scaled or maybe ridged. Its eyes were huge, and the closer it got, the smaller I felt. It was massive, beyond the description of size or dimensions, and the closer it got, the less I wanted to be the focus of that attention. This must be what an ant felt like as it stood on a finger of a human, what an insect felt like before the frog devours it, and I could feel my whole body vibrating under the strain of its continued existence. It seemed to lean closer as it came up before me, our bodies inches from each other, and when it spoke, I could feel it in my bones. "Welcome back, my child." It reached out a massive finger, the print on the end looking like the indicators on a map. Even the end of that finger was bigger than my whole body, and it was like someone reaching out with a building to touch me. I closed my eyes, feeling it would obliterate me with that massive digit. But when it came into contact with my forehead, I was enveloped in a blinding light that burned me to a cinder. I came up gasping and thrashing from the depths, the pastor catching me as the congregation cheered. As their applause rose to envelop me, I looked down at the pool, expecting to see myself floating or standing on the edge of a lip, but the whole baptismal font was only about 2 feet deep. Standing up, I could see the water wasn't even over my knees. The pastor looked up, still bent and kneeling at the bottom of the pool, and his expression was resplendent. Did he know what would happen? Did anything happen while I was floating in that abyss? The longer I stared at him, the longer I came to believe that he had known what would happen, and his eyes seemed to be trying to calm me as he stood and embraced me as a brother. As he did, I heard him whisper into my ear to be easy. "Steady on, son, steady on. It's a little jarring at first, but it's all over now. Rejoice in the light, and be well." When I looked at him again, I could see a deeper understanding in his eyes, something I didn't know how I had missed before. When I looked out across the congregation, it was a look I saw mirrored in them as well. I was speechless, unsure of what to do, and when he led me out of the pool, it was all I could do not to break into a run. He offered me a towel, letting me stand shivering beside the pool as he asked the others if they wanted to come up. When the second man approached, seeming more hesitant than I had been, I grabbed my things and snuck out the choir entrance that led to the fellowship hall. It was empty now, the whole space covered in semi-shadow, and within that shadow, I could feel the regard of whatever had spoken to me in the depths. The next thing I knew, I was in my car and driving too fast from him. It was a miracle that I didn't get pulled over, though I briefly wondered who I had to thank for that. As I sit here now, my shaking has nothing to do with the cold. If this was the God of my father, the God I've been praying to all my life, then I think I'd rather be an atheist. Even as I sit here now, I can still imagine floating in that void as the ancient creature regards me kindly, its mind brushing against my own, and the dread threatening to overtake me again. I'd pray for oblivion, but I know what's waiting there for me now. One more story for you. Then I think I'm going to crack a book of my own and see what there is to be seen. Maybe one of my Stephen King hardbacks off the shelf. I don't know. They've just been begging to be read lately. TV can be quite a blessing sometimes. We all have our favorite programs, things we love to watch, things that bring us joy. But sometimes we have to make sure those things don't dominate our lives in strange and unforeseen ways. So, if you're thinking about watching a little TV later, be sure to avoid whatever channel is playing Dark Haven.
"Rachel, are you sitting right in front of that television again?" came her mother's high, reedy voice from the kitchen. No, Rachel called back, her voice incredulous, as if her mom would just assume something like that. Like she'd just hear the TV, always television to her, and always in the tone of deepest scorn, and assume that Rachel was sitting 5 feet from it. In truth, it would have likely been easier to split the atom than slide a piece of notebook paper between Rachel's face and the murky glow of the old television set. Like most of the children who had reached the age of 10 in this time of technological marvels, Rachel found her entire world balanced within the glow of that box. In it were held the 500 TV channels of her life: sports, cartoons, news, cartoons, current events, cartoons, and the scary movies that her mother would have had a fit if she knew she were watching. Rachel quickly spooled the channels through to the 5 or 6 that showed scary movies, being careful to move the volume down to 2 little green bumps that would ensure her mother didn't hear the TV. Her mother would have an absolute coronary if she knew Rachel was watching anything that wasn't approved family television by the Council for Moral and Ethical Values. Even in her head, Rachel always assumed this name was delivered in a reedy, nasal voice of a cultured and obviously boring old man. The whole town was like that, so caught up in their own ancient sense of what was right and wrong that they didn't seem to understand that times were changing. It was like Burrow was caught in the 50s sometimes. All the kids in town lived on their TVs. It was just a way of life. She spooled through the TV guide and saw that 3 movies were playing later that she wanted to see. Carrie was playing at 10:30, but that was much too soon. Her mother might be good and asleep by 11, but not by 10:30. The other channel, however, was showing Child's Play at 10:30, followed by something called Dark Haven. As she read the description, she knew that Dark Haven was the one she wanted to see tonight. The description sounded pretty cool, and it promised a true scare not often found in modern horror. The runtime was just over an hour, too, so even if her mom woke up at 2, as she was sometimes wont to do, she could easily be back in bed and well asleep before. And what is this? Rachel squeaked a little, and the remote clattered to the floor. Batteries rolled hither and thither as the back cover came off, and she turned her head to see her mother hovering over her. Rachel's mother wasn't an unattractive woman, but the worry lines and stress a pair of jobs brought on her had worn her down before her time. She now stood, legs spread in a linebacker's blocking stance, with her thick blonde hair thrown hastily into a messy tail, and her hands covered in the remains of tonight's dinner dish suds. Her face wasn't set cruelly, despite what Rachel thought. She'd never once seen anything more than parental displeasure from her mother. She was wearing the stern look she reserved just for Rachel, though, it seemed. "Nothing," Rachel said again. Just trying to give herself nightmares for the next 500 years, she said as she bent down and pushed the button on the front of the TV. It went off with a little staticky smack sound that reduced it to nothing but a dumb, lifeless box. "Off to bed now. It's well past your bedtime. The idea that I'd allow such filth in my—" But Rachel had listened to just about as much as she cared to of that. She'd frozen on the bottom step like a ballet dancer, preparing for her opening move. And what an opening move this was likely to be. "They aren't filth, Mother. I happen to like horror movies. If you weren't so close-minded, maybe you'd find out that you like them too." Her mother's stern face had flushed red at that, the deep scarlet it always turned before the two had one of their more and more common arguments. "Don't you dare take that short tone with me, young lady. This is still my house, and as long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules, and you can forget about TV for 2 days because of your sass." Rachel was affronted. But that's not fair. What am I supposed to do for 2 days? There's nothing else to do in this stupid town. No one ever wants to play outside or come over to visit. They all just want to watch TV. "Well, for 2 days, I guess you won't be one of them. Maybe you can be the first one to actually go out, and why don't you just admit it? Why don't you just admit that you hate me? Why don't you just admit that you love making my life miserable?" A silence hung between them for a minute. Rachel was walking down a dark path, but she didn't care. She knew that what she would do next would hurt her mother, hurt her worse than she'd ever hurt her before, but she didn't care. "And just where did you get an idea like that? Why would I hate you?" Her mother's voice was incredulous and low, as though it was all she could do to breathe out the words. "I heard you once, talking to Mrs. Dempsey, talking about all the things you'd do if only you didn't have children. all the exciting things the two of you would do if only you didn't have children at home to take care of. Well, why don't you just go and do them? Because I honestly wish that I didn't have a mother." She didn't even stop to see how deeply she had wounded her. She stormed upstairs and slammed her door shut between herself and the whole stupid world. She came awake all at once and looked over at the clock on her bedside table. 11:30 p.m. She couldn't believe she'd dozed off. What if she'd missed it? She'd already had to miss Child's Play thanks to her mother's stupid racket. She rolled away from the clock and couldn't help feeling sorry for her mother. She'd expected another fight, a longer punishment maybe. She might have even sassed her way into what her friends called a spanking, which her mother had never believed in. Instead, she'd just cried. Rachel had heard her climb the stairs from underneath her covers and was sure that the door would open any minute. Her mother would come storming in with a belt or a paddle or maybe even just her hand and a still glowering rage at her cheeky daughter. But instead, she just went to bed. She'd opened her door and flopped out onto the big bed she'd once shared with Rachel's father before he left, and began to cry. Rachel couldn't remember ever hearing her mother cry, not even when she was 3. Her father had left, saying it just wasn't working out. He didn't love Rachel's mother anymore, and hadn't even bothered to say anything to Rachel. For the better part of an hour, her mother had sobbed furiously, choked anguished sobs that she didn't think would ever end, at least until she'd heard them change into deep, rhythmic snores. This had been at about 10:05, but Rachel hadn't dared to sneak down to the TV. Her mother could be shamming, though Rachel didn't think she was. Rachel didn't want to risk missing the movie she really wanted to see because she had been too hasty. She'd seen Child's Play about 100 times anyway, and had decided to close her eyes just for a second when 11:35 p.m. She'd sneak down to the living room in about 20 minutes, just to make sure that her mother was still good and asleep. No sense spoiling it now by being overeager. She rolled over, and her guilt rolled with her. She shouldn't have said that to her mom. It wasn't fair, and thinking about it now, her mother probably meant nothing by it. Whose mother didn't want a life where they didn't have responsibilities or children? Rachel was mature enough to understand that, but 11:38 p.m. But it was still a rotten thing to say. Rachel was here, and her mother thinking that way made her feel like she didn't care whether she lived or died. And she was always such a bother anyway. "Rachel, clean your room. Rachel, finish your vegetables. That's not appropriate subject matter for a child your age, Rachel." What did she know anyway? Who was she to judge what was and wasn't right for her to do? 11:39 p.m. Rachel rolled over angrily, and now time was being slow on purpose. She listened closely again and could still hear her mother's deep snoring from the other room. She could probably sneak down right now and catch the climactic ending of Child's Play. Her mother would never be the wiser. But no, Rachel wouldn't spoil it for a bad slasher flick ending that she'd seen 100 times. She'd bide her time until 11:41 p.m. She was sure that she could sneak down and not get caught. She felt her eyes getting heavy again and stifled a yawn. She would not get tired and fall asleep. That was not an option. She lasted this long, and she would last a little longer. She'd have to make sure she didn't fall asleep on the couch or something, like that one time a few months ago. Luckily, her mom hadn't woken up till nearly 7 after the storm had knocked the power out. The TV had been off, and all she'd been able to yell at her for was not waking her up and falling asleep on the couch. Oh, but hadn't that been a good night? Watching Ether Man during a rainstorm, and having to stifle a scream when the lightning had peeled out just as the knife slash had landed. 11:43 p.m. Rachel threw the covers off angrily. If time wasn't going to cooperate, then she'd just go ahead and risk it. She pulled on her fluffy pink slippers and her black bathrobe for night sneaking, and opened the door to her room carefully. It gave 1 or 2 traitorous squeaks, but they were small ones. Her mother's breathing never altered in the least. She slunk carefully into the hallway, past her mother's door, and down the steps as she tried hard to avoid the loose 8th step. Finally, she was down in the living room. She flipped on the TV and was bathed instantly in its warm, staticky glow. It was on the right channel, too. Child's Play was just ending, the credits beginning to roll, and the volume was still at the right level for night watching. She reclined against the couch as she waited for the letters to glide slowly to an end. She folded over herself and took a pillow off the couch to rest her head against. As the last name spilled sluggishly by, the screen lit up with a short infomercial about stock in a growing business firm. She flipped on the info button and read the description of Darkhaven again. As the smiling cowboy-hatted speaker finally delivered his tagline, "So put your trust in smiling Walter Rigsby, and you'll see the returns growing like our condos." Then the screen went eerily dark for what felt like hours. When it lit again, it was panning in on a dark forest, probably one in New England or Maine, and Rachel was accosted by the creepy circus grind of the intro music. She sighed. She couldn't believe she'd be missing TV for 2 days because of a slop-budget late 70s B-movie. The production value looked shoddy, even to a 10-year-old, and the camera work looked like some guy with a camcorder had shot it. She shrugged. Might as well see how it played out. It was only an hour and change anyway. The story started slow. Some settlers on a boat were in a bad storm, one of those Christopher Columbus specials with masts and lots of wood. A man on board was writing to his wife about how he missed her and wished she'd come with him to the new colony. There was some flashbacks, him arguing with some other buckle hat guy and asking some others to leave with him. Then a guy burst into his cabin and told him he was needed on deck. The following scene had been a little cool. Some of the men that came up to help had been washed overboard as they tried to save the ship. The actors were doing a pretty good job of drowning as the boat sailed away, unable to rescue them, though they were certainly trying with all they had. It got boring again pretty quick after they landed. Lots of farming, lots of good morrows and banter. There was one old woman they seemed to think was a witch, but they left her alone instead of burning her like they usually did in these types of movies. Rachel was starting to nod off when an Indian came into town one day, accompanied by some equally as unbelievably white-looking Indians. He told the letter writer, who was their mayor or leader or something, that they had settled on sacred ground to the local tribe, and that they would have to move the town or suffer the Indians' wrath. This led to a good little stretch of Indians returning nightly to burn their houses and kill people. Believably kill people, too. When one Indian brave buried his tomahawk in one of the settlers, she wasn't honestly sure she could see the effects that made the blood splatter. The scalping looked pretty grisly, too, as did the horse dragging and the execution of the braves they caught during the attack. This progressed until the people of the village had gathered to try to find a way to stop the Indians from attacking Darkhaven. The Indians had called it Darkhaven in their native tongue, and so some of the settlers had taken to calling it that too. Rachel was interested by this point. The movie had turned out to be not only very gory, but also very grabbing. She couldn't remember why it had been boring before. Suddenly, every character seemed more than real, and every death was as real as it would have been if it had been one of her own family members. The village's salvation came from an unexpected source. The old witch woman turned out to have a book that told her how to call forth a terrible power. "He will crush the savages," she told them, "in exchange for a pure soul." The townspeople then, with little to no discussion it seemed, rushed out to find a virgin, despite the protests of their leader and the local priest. Rachel sat close, a paper's breadth between her and the TV. They took a young woman and strapped her to the ground. The old witch cackled as she drew around the sobbing girl in the dirt, and the woman screamed and writhed as she pulled at her chains. She begged them to release her, tears pouring down her face as the old hag began to work her magic. The townspeople, for their part, mostly just stood around and looked somber and embarrassed. They didn't seem to know what to do here, and as the witch's spell began, many seemed to have second thoughts. It was too late, though. The drawing in the dirt began to glow painfully bright, and thrum in a dark crystalline purple that made Rachel squint. The woman screamed and screamed as the black ooze spilled from the ground. The ooze rolled over her dress, up her legs, and slid into her mouth with... The scene suddenly turned to snow. Signal lost. "No!" Rachel howled, throwing a hand over her mouth a second later to stifle the furious scream that would have followed. She began to pound her fist on the glass eye that so cruelly cheated her. She began to scream as loud as she dared at this hateful little monster of glass and plastic. She hated it. It built her up, and then snatched her prize away at the last minute. She hated it so much she... Her hand made a wet sound as she struck the screen. She pulled her fist back and looked down at the darkened surface. What was that? She held it to the salt and pepper snow of the television and looked in confusion at the dark liquid on her fist. Was that mud? Her hand covered in... Good God! As she looked down at the slick substance on the underside of her curled fist, it writhed and pulled away from her skin slightly. No, it was a trick of the light. It had to be. It had to be blood or something. She'd burst a vessel, slamming her stupid hand against the TV. That had to be it. It couldn't... Plop. She looked up. Plop. Something was falling out of the TV. Plop, plop. Was it her blood? There seemed to be an awful lot of it. It pooled on the carpet before her eyes, coming out in rivulets from the staticky eye. It soaked into the thick tangle of shaggy carpet, and Rachel scuttled crab-like away from it. One huge piece fell from the center of the snow. It's quivering. It's beating, Rachel thought. She didn't know why she thought this until something solid floated to the top of the pool. It rolled drunkenly in the murk, and as it rolled, it began to pulsate, to throb, to send little ripples out from the pulsating mass. It was a heart. The goop began to move, congealing, and then lifting itself up bonelessly like a waterspout from the world's darkest puddle. It hung there looking at her as it studied her scared face. Though it had no eyes, she knew it looked. She felt her breath coming in stuttering skips as she stared into the scariest thing she had ever seen in her whole life. It wavered like the jello her mother sometimes made for dessert. Then one thin leg broke from the black surge and took a liquid step towards her. She was over the couch in a flash and watched as it buckled and fell juicily against the coffee table, full of old art books her mother had lovingly kept there. It splattered and covered the chintzy farmscape, but then drew itself back together quickly as it began to assume a more human form. Its arms and legs were too thin, its torso like one of those department store mannequins she'd seen in Woolworth's, and its head was a vague oval with a sleek, featureless face. But still, she knew. It saw her. Her fear grabbed her fully, but unlike most children, her fear always transferred into flight. She took to the stairs 3 at a time. She drove through her bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her. It rattled and buckled not a heartbeat later, and came open with a monstrous crunch. She was thrown like a rag doll across the room and onto her own bed. The creature was inside, already lunging towards her. It tripped on those 2 thin legs, though, and one of them connected with her beanbag chair. She leapt over it. She was out of her room again, slamming the door shut behind her as the creature gained its feet again. She ran to her mother's room, her fists sounding like cannon shots as she banged frantically on the door. "Mom! Mommy! Please! Help me!" Her mother, dressed in the same rumpled clothes she'd come home in, threw the door open, brandishing a long wooden bat as she came into the hallway. She looked left, looked right, and then dropped panting to clutch at Rachel. "Honey? Rachel, what's wrong?" "A man, a thing, it's in my room, it's... But then she realized with real terror that it hadn't followed her. Something that quick should have been through the door and after her in a heartbeat. She looked back at the closed door, and dread began to coil there. Why hadn't it come after her? Rachel's mother looked at the door, and then pushed her daughter behind her. "I'll go have a look. You stay here. Call 911 if something happens." "No, Mom, please. Please don't leave me. Let's go call them now, and they can..." But she was down the hall, and to the door faster than the creature could have even managed. Her mother put herself against the wall like a SWAT cop preparing to burst into a drug house. She brought her foot up and kicked the door, and Rachel cringed and closed her eyes, expecting the thing to leap on her mother, and 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. No screaming, no yelling, nothing. She opened her eyes and saw her mother walking around the room, checking in the closet, looking under the bed, behind the furniture. She had turned on the lights, and with it didn't seem half so scary as it had a minute ago. Her mother swept the entire room 3 times, baseball bat at the ready, but after the 3rd time, she shrugged and turned back to her still shivering daughter. "Well, no boogeymen, Rachel, no monsters, no shadows, but I did find this little creature waiting patiently for you to stumble over him." She held out a well-worn teddy that Rachel had had since she was a baby. She'd put it on top of her closet. It seemed childish to have something like that on her bed at her age, but she was honestly glad to see it now. Her mother smiled and took a step towards the door. "Look who doesn't need a mother now, huh?" she said, not in her snippy ha-ha voice, but in her warm mother voice Rachel had heard less and less of these days, and would never hear again. Before she made it halfway to the threshold, the light on her table popped off with a smell like burning plastic. Rachel's mother turned to look at it, her face now cut in half by the darkness, but only Rachel saw the thin sliver of darkness that wrapped lovingly around her ankle. Her mother registered it a moment before it went taut as a noose, and Rachel saw a sad mix of terror, regret, and savage resolve to fight anything that threatened her child. Surprise and bemusement at the thought of being so vulnerable in her own home snap across her mother's face. "Rachel," she said, before she was dragged bonelessly to the floor and pulled, hardwood ribbons rising from her fingernails, under the bed. The baseball bat made a queer hollow plink as it hit the floor, a heartbeat before that ragged old bear. By then, though, her mother had disappeared an eternity ago to her daughter's eyes, into the inky blackness beneath her bed. The door slammed, and Rachel was left alone in the hallway.
I think that'll just about do it for us today. Don't you? Ha, that's a trick question. You guys would let me ramble on all day, we both know. But this will conclude another episode of Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. I do hope you'll join me some other time, though. Till then, have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.